Good morning, everybody. We, ADB, we are here once again to launch our annual flagship publication called Asia Economic Integration Report. Thank you to the LKY School for its repeated support for this particular publication, and we have been launching with them for a while now. To start the event, may I welcome Mr. Albert Park, Chief Economist and Director General of Asian Development Bank, to give the opening remarks. I must say that you will find all the detailed bio of the speakers and our panelists in the LKY event page. You can watch us live stream on the ADB LinkedIn page and X, which was formerly known as Twitter. So without further ado, over to Albert.
Thanks. Thank you, Sanchita. Colleagues, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it really gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this year's Asian Economic Integration Report, or AEIR 2024. We're extremely happy to return to Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for this launch event. I want to thank Vice Dean Bajpai and the team here at LYK School for their usual great hospitality and excellent support. As the world continues to grapple with geopolitical divisions, especially in a year where many people are going to the polls to elect new leaders, regional cooperation appears to actually be gaining strength, much more so than global cooperation. In Asia, particularly developing Asia, economic integration continues to deepen between countries and subregions. As the report will explain, regional integration has become a crucial buffer against global shocks, helping to soften negative impacts. We believe that even as rising protectionism or the risks of global fragmentation compound economic challenges, increased cooperation and investment in connectivity, whether the soft regulatory type or hard physical infrastructure, can strengthen economic resilience. Now, it is true that trade across the region has been relatively stagnant these past 2 years, although even then it varies quite a lot across countries. For instance, ASEAN, Japan, and the Republic of Korea have actually seen trade expand during this period. Following the pandemic, participation in global value chains has rebounded relatively strongly, reorienting more towards regional value chains, with backward linkages growing stronger and forward linkages becoming more diverse. Trade policy continues to evolve rapidly, with broad modern trade and digital agreements being negotiated. In Asia and the Pacific, 5 agreements entered into force and 17 new agreements were signed in 2023. The region's financial integration globally remains strong, but also leaves it vulnerable to capital flow volatility caused by shocks emanating from developed economies. This year's AEIR theme chapter is on Decarbonizing Global Value Chains, or GVCs. The relationship between international trade, GVCs, and greenhouse gas emissions is complex. International trade links global production networks, which provides great economic opportunities, especially for poorer countries. But extracting raw materials, turning them into intermediate goods, shipping them for final assembly, and eventually to consumers all over the world, involves production and transportation processes that create carbon dioxide emissions. Now, how much emissions each step of this process requires depends on the sources of energy used, as well as the technology that is employed. So we feel there is a potential for GVCs to actually help mitigate climate change by promoting trade in low-emission goods and transferring green technologies that can also increase production efficiency. So this is one area where global cooperation is really essential and where efforts are being made. Carbon pricing is generally considered to be a key mechanism for reducing carbon dioxide emissions during production. Accurate embedded emissions accounting mechanisms provide a key infrastructure to ensure rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon intensity. Trade agreements can help reduce value chain-related emissions by embracing environmental provisions. And technological innovation and diffusion can be an integral part of global efforts to decarbonize production systems. The theme chapter takes a close look at the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, to study how it will affect the global carbon footprint and also economic welfare under different scenarios, with a focus especially on implications for Asia and the Pacific. The results are quite interesting, showing that CBAM will affect exports from Asia to Europe, but overall will have relatively muted impacts on global carbon emissions and on Asian economies, given the limited coverage of CBAM. But if CBAM expands to many countries, the impacts would be much greater. Let me conclude by saying once again, welcome to this morning's presentation and panel discussion. I hope you will find that reading this year's Asian Economic Integration Report to be informative as we all work together toward a path to a greener, sustainable, and inclusive development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Albert Park. For the next segment, may I request Professor Kanti Bajpai, Vice Dean Research and Development and Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies, Lee Kuan Yew's School of Public Policy, to give his welcome remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Sanchita. Welcome to all of you, particularly, of course, Albert Park, Chief Economist and Director General of the ADB and his team here. But ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and others. Actually, there aren't many others, particularly from the school, although we have a great interest in all these subjects, in the future of the global economy, regional economy, issues of climate change. We have at least two research centers, the Asia Competitiveness Institute and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, that have cognate interest to all these subjects. And of course, we have our share of economists and students interested in these subjects, but it's mid-semester break, and they're all on the beaches of Bali somewhere, I think, rather than listening to this very fine set of presentations that lie ahead. Thanks so much, ADB, for making us a port of call and launching here. As I say, I wish we had a bigger audience, but I'm sure the word will get out on this terrific report. So great pleasure, as always, to have you in our midst. Obviously, in a time of deglobalization and climate change, what could be more timely than this report? As Albert said, there are some rather interesting highlights. I mean, it's quite reassuring to know that regional integration continues apace post-COVID, and for all the talk of kind of the retreat from more open trade and more open economies. I was also struck by the extent to which in the report, Asia and the Pacific's technology and digital connectivity dimension seems to be quite an important part of this kind of growing integration. I mean, you hear a lot about that, but I guess the report will kind of lock it down or provide more empirical backup for that assertion. It's also interesting that the intra-sub-regional integration grew faster than inter-sub-regional integration in these various regions, except for South Asia, which seems to have integrated more to the various sub-regions. also, I guess in my mind, I hadn't quite put global value chains and carbon emissions and climate change together. So that connectivity, as it were, or correlation opened my eyes. And in this time of kind of China +1 and so on, it's probably useful to recognize that those who are the +1s will have to keep an eye on the carbon footprint issue, even as they get more deeply integrated into global value chains. And of course, I thought it was interesting too in the report of the danger of the race to the bottom, I think. As these global value chains do proliferate, companies have an incentive to try and beat the system by lowering standards. So I guess you'll hear quite a lot about that. Of course, technology might ride to the rescue, and I think the report makes gestures towards the role of technology diffusion in trying to help us through the problem. Won't say much more. I think there's a lot ahead of you this morning, and I wish I could stay to listen to all that debate, but I broke my phone coming back from Chennai, and I've got to log back onto various systems, and IT will take about an hour of my time to do that, and then I have to go and regale my dean with all my latest activities over lunch. So welcome once again to this session. Great to see you all here. Albert and team, thank you so much for doing this. Really look forward to hosting you in future events as well. And with that, let me just close my remarks and hand it back to Sanchita. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bajpai. Moving next to the next segment of our agenda today, may I request Dr. Jongwoo Kang, Director, Regional Cooperation and Integration Division of ADB, to share the findings of Asia Economic Integration Report 2024. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanchita. So it's always a great pleasure to be back to Lee Kuan Yew School to launch our flagship publication. So this year's AEIR 2024, the theme chapter is on the Decarbonizing Global Value Chains, as was mentioned by our Chief Economist, Albert Ba. So let me first go over key messages of this report before I go into the details of the report. First, based on the metric, the regional integration of the Asia and the Pacific region continues to deepen quite steadily. And then one of the key features of the Asia's global value chain landscape is the more weight into the downstream part of the global value chain. So this means that many of the regional economies have imported various intermediate goods and imports to manufacture those into the final goods and exporting to other countries instead of supplying intermediate goods to other countries. Thirdly, when it comes to FDI, so what we have observed is that FDI's interest sectors in particular are showing some clear signs of diversifying away from the East Asia, centered around China in particular, and covering other sub-regions like the South Asian Pacific in the region. And we believe that potential capital flow reversal risks could be mitigated through the strong regional cooperation and the strong regional financial safety net, which I elaborate more on in the succeeding slides. Digital technology can promote the seamless cross-border remittance flows and at the same time can contribute and support the sustainable recovery of the tourism industry in the region, we believe. And moving on to the theme chapter, GVC-related carbon emissions are growing faster than any other sources in the world. And also, in the case of developing Asia, the picture has become more dire in the sense that the region's share out of the GVC-related total global emissions has been increasing over time. And as we all know, the EU is now trying to implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so-called the CBAM, and then this is based on some of the some of the inferior situation of the EU firms are facing due to the high carbon price under the EU's emissions trading system. And they try to level the playing field by containing some of the potential carbon leakages, which means that some of the production capacities within the EU could be relocated to the other regions, other countries, because of, again, the high carbon cost the EU firms are facing in the domestic market. But based on our analysis, the EU CBAM is likely to have only very marginal emission reduction impact globally. At the same time, it can have quite substantial negative impact to the exports of some Asian subregions due to their quite high export exposure to the EU. But one interesting finding we have found is that the CBAM also will likely to have the quite significant negative impact to the downstream manufacturing output of the EU themselves because of the spillover impacts from the upstream side. Then in our report, we have come up with 4 major pillars of policy recommendation. First one is the carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is believed to be the most efficient means to green the production procedure by internalizing social cost of the emissions into the private cost with the price signal, which can reflect opportunity cost of emissions. And then the accounting mechanism for the embedded emissions as a key infrastructure which can support accurate reporting, measuring, and verification system of the carbon emissions embedded across different segments of global value chain, and the trade cooperation, in particular through the free trade agreement, which can adopt environmental provisions to support green trade further. And lastly, the technological advancement and technology diffusion across different countries around the world. So, as was mentioned by the Vice Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School, Asia has shown quite steady growth in terms of the regional integration based on our Asia and the Pacific Cooperation and Integration Index. In particular, the technology and digital connectivity, which is represented by the dark blue line, shows quite the steep increasing trend over the past decades or so. When it comes to the sub-regional level integration, as was mentioned, but also again the Vice Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School, most of the sub-regions in the Asia have shown stronger sub-regional level connectivity within sub-regions than the connectivity with other sub-regions within Asia. The only exception is the South Asia. South Asia is actually getting more connected with the East Asia and Southeast Asia on the fronts of trade, both trade and foreign direct investment. So again, the Asia's GBC landscape is more weighted to the downstream by becoming largely the manufacturer of the final assembly. So historically, the backward GBC linkages have been stronger and longer for most Asian countries. And then both forward and backward linkage have rebounded quite strongly since the height of the pandemic back in 2020. Then on the right-hand side bar chart, we are showing that one of the key features of the region's GBC landscape is the quite significant progress in terms of regionalization of the GBC. So many of the regional economies are strengthening their GBC connectivity within Asia instead of outside of Asia. This is more pronounced on the segment of the forward linkage than the backward. So moving on to the FDI stories, the FDI globally as well as in the region were quite robust in 2022, but coming into 2023, what we have observed is that declining FDI trend into the region. So on the greenfield investment side, the trend continues to be quite robust and solid, but when it comes to M&As, number of deals have declined quite significantly in 2023, perhaps due to the tighter capital market and financial market conditions under the elevated level of the global interest rate to contain the inflation pressures around the globe. On the right-hand side, what we are showing is that despite the volatility and the fluctuation in terms of the global FDI inflows over years, what we have found is the quite steady and incessant increase and rise in terms of the FDI into the strategic sectors, such as the semiconductors, telecommunication, 5G, equipment for green energy transition, and the pharmaceutical ingredients and the critical minerals. So this is quite a clear sign of the global investors' keen interest in the strategic sectors when it comes to making investment into the region and globally. And then the non-resident capital flows to Asia declined slightly in 2023, again, under the global interest rate hiking cycles. But coming into 2023, the flows have recovered. On the right-hand side, based on our decomposition of the flows, this recovery is mainly led by the portfolio equity investment, other investment. But since the so-called the U.S. Fed pivot December last year, the portfolio debt inflows into the region have also started to increase. So remittance story, the global remittance and the remittance into the region declined a little bit in 2022 at the height of the pandemic. But since then, the global and the regional remittance flows have rebounded quite significantly. Then for the region, the quite strong remittance inflow streams are mainly due to the quite relative strong economic recovery in the major out-migration destination of the region, and then the quite tighter labor market conditions and also lack of skilled laborers there. At the center, we are showing the tourism arrival trends. In the case of the region, the tourism arrivals recovery was quite substantial in 2023, reaching around 73% of the pre-pandemic level. But the region's performance is still lagging behind other regions such as Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, as you can see from the center chart. One of the major regions behind the regions lagging behind other regions is that even after the lifting the lockdowns by PRC back in end of 2022, the trend of arrivals from China to the region, which historically has been the major source of tourism arrivals, has not been recovering back to the pandemic level yet. So I'm going to talk some about the issues and the policy implication across the various fronts as I have covered. So Asia's relative downstreamness in terms of GVC landscape is also confirmed by our GVC GVC position index. The higher the index, it means that the region or country is positioned more downward of the GVC. So in the case of Asia, as the orange line indicates, the region's downstreamness is unparalleled by any other regions in the world. And then the second and the third chart are indicating that one of the drawbacks or weakness of the region's GVC landscape is that the lack of diversification, and the more, in particular, the backward linkages are more centered around a few number of the countries for sourcing of the resources and intermediate goods. So although there have been some progress which has made over the past decade, still the backward linkages are more concentrated, and then the trend has got worsened since the pandemic further, although there has been some progress made on the forward front since the pandemic. So this means that the regional economies could be exposed to potential supply chain disruption risks in the upstream part of the GVC linkages than the downstream. So this has some policy implication for the policymakers in the region to think about in the future. So we have also looked at trade-related food security issues across the different food items like the sugar, rice, onions, and then the other products. We have examined how much individual countries are producing to serve domestic consumption as a proxy for the self-sufficiency. And those who are mainly relying on the imports for those products, we have also looked at how much those countries have a diversified import trading partners, and also in terms of number of the import products. So based on those three criteria, we've selected 10 countries in this table across different food products. So these countries are showing some, in a sense, some relative food security vulnerability across the food products we are indicating here in this table. On the right-hand side, the problems with the regional food supply security has been exacerbated by the significant number of rise in terms of the trade restrictions, such as export bans, and then the quotas, and then the tariffs. And as you can see from the right-hand side chart, Asia and the Pacific region has been exposed to this kind of restrictive trade measures more than any other regions in the world. So as I mentioned, the FDI into the strategic sectors, such as those 5 sectors I have illustrated, are showing some kind of diversification away from the East Asia. When we compare 2 periods between 2003 to 2008 and 2019 and 2020, obviously, as you can see from the above chart, back in the previous 3 periods, most of the FDI interest rate sectors have been focused on East Asia, centered around China. But coming into the recent years, the FDI investment are diversifying to include other sub-regions such as South Asia, and the Pacific and Oceania. So engaging both export-import FDI into the stress sectors are so-called efficiency-seeking FDIs, which can be supported by the R&D investment of the host economies and also a stronger enforcement of investment protection, for example, in the host economies. We also believe that the regional economies can also capitalize on the strengthening purchasing power, building on the expanding domestic consumption market and the rising middle-income class to attract more market-seeking FDI into the region, in particular by improving the regulatory regimes in the service sector. The closer interconnectedness with the global financial market as well as regional capital market has contributed to the capital market development of the region, but at the same time, it can expose the region to potential capital flow reversals due to the factors which may not be related to the host economy. So one of those potential factors is the US dollar funding cost. So in this slide, we have simulated potential impact of US dollar funding cost rise. So based on our analysis, regression analysis, once the standard deviation of rise in terms of US dollar funding cost, either measured by US Fed funds rate or the real effective exchange rate of US dollar or the principal component of these 2 measures, tend to increase that investment outflows away from the region by a quarter of the 1% out of the GDP. So we believe that the regional economies can mitigate the capital flow reversal risks through various policy measures. First one is the bank's balance sheet should be strengthened. The banks should be better reserved, better capitalized, and their liquidity management should improve, and also currency risk should be better hedged. And then also the local currency bond market should be further developed through regional initiatives such as Asian Bond Market Initiative, also at the national level. And then as necessary, the policymakers can deploy, the macroprudential policy should be deployed as a regular measure, but as necessary, some additional measures such as foreign exchange interventions or the capital flow management measures can be also adopted by policymakers in the region as necessary and on a temporary basis. And the last but not least, the regional finance arrangement architecture for the SM+3, we have the CMIM, Chiang Initiative Multilateralization, but how to ensure the better workability and the functionability of CMIM is something that the policymakers in the region need to think about going forward. One of the critical issues related to the remittance flows across the borders is the remittance cost. And then in that regard, the region has shown quite significant progress, reaching 5.2% of remittance cost by 2020, which is way lower than the global average of 6.3%, but still much higher than the 3% of SDG goal by 2030. We believe the digital remittance retains a lot of the great potential in further lowering the remittance cost. Actually, the digital remittance entails only 4.4% of remittance cost compared to the conventional remittance flows. Then when we have a look at the left-hand side bar chart, still the portion of the global digital remittance out of the total remittance account for less than 20%. So going forward, we believe that the regional economies need to strengthen policy efforts to build more digital payment infrastructure and also strengthen cooperation on cross-border payment system and ensure the regulatory harmonization to facilitate the cross-border remittance flows into the region. And the digital technology can also promote the tourism's long-term growth and resilience by encompassing the entire tourism ecosystem, starting from travel and booking, transportation, accommodation, and also by adopting the digital technology and solutions to support the leisure and the tour activities in the region. So before we move on to the theme chapter, which is on the decarbonizing global value chain, we are going to play a short video clip as an overview.
In recent decades, we have seen greenhouse gas emissions rise rapidly. This has been largely driven by our reliance on fossil fuels in pursuing economic development and industrialization. Asia and the Pacific has seen deepening climate change impacts. Disasters and extreme weather are increasing in a region that has limited resources for mitigation and adaptation. A sprawling global production network and deepening global value chains are among the major causes of higher emissions. In fact, production-based carbon dioxide emissions from global value chains grew significantly faster than emissions from other sources. This is of particular concern for developing Asian economies, as they have become critical players within global value chains. To help reduce the carbon footprint of global value chains, there are policy options available. Carbon pricing can be the most efficient mechanism in internalizing the environmental costs of production. Trade agreements can help decarbonize value chains by including environmental provisions. Accurately measuring emissions from and within global value chains can underpin appropriate monitoring and regulation measures. Many economies have launched carbon pricing mechanisms. But the fragmented nature of carbon pricing creates the risk of carbon leakage, as emissions could rise when production is moved from an economy with more stringent environmental policies to one that is more lenient. This, in turn, motivates the introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism is expected to cut carbon leakage from the EU's emission trading scheme by around a half. However, it will have a limited effect on global carbon dioxide emissions, and it is likely to reduce both global trade and Asia's exports, while production in some downstream sectors within the EU will also decline. That said, extending carbon pricing and carbon border adjustment mechanisms to other regions may reduce global emissions significantly, although the carbon leakage problem may persist without a global solution. Different distributional impacts across economies will require careful consideration and discussions of the economic incentives for joining in these initiatives. A holistic approach is crucial in decarbonizing global value chains. This can be done by increasing investments in green infrastructure, promoting technological advancement, and prioritizing sustainable investment across value chain segments. Please read our latest Asian Economic Integration Report to learn more.
So the narrator's voice is much better than mine. I'll try to cover the slides. So actually, the global CO2 emissions are estimated to have reached the 37 billion metric ton in 2023. So this is both in terms of the production-based and consumption-based. At the end of the day, all the produced CO2 emissions in one way or another are to be consumed by someone else. So the production-based global emissions can be affected by both scale and efficiency effect. In the case of developing Asia, on the right-hand side bar chart, as we are showing, the scale effect, the efficiency effect due to the technological advancement has contributed significantly in reducing the growth rate of CO2 emissions by the region by more than 110%. But the sheer scale effect in terms of the population growth and the economic growth far outweigh the CO2 emission reduction effect from technological advancement, making the region's growth rate of CO2 emission between 1995 and 2018 more than 100%, which is much higher than any other regions in the world. So GVC-related emissions, the global production-based CO2 emission, which reached 37 billion metric ton in 2023, can be decomposed three parts. First one is the emissions related to production for domestic consumption. Second one, that for pure trade. Third one is the emission-related GVC activities. And then the GVC-related emissions have grown much faster than any other sources, the other two sources. And as you can see from this slide, the annual global CO2 emissions increased by 57% between 1995 and 2018, while emissions due to the GVC increased much faster by 84%, which is also shown in the left-hand side, the line chart. And in the case of developing Asia, as I mentioned during the key messages, the performance has been even worse. The developing Asia's share out of global GVC-related emissions increased from 23% to 42% during the same period. Actually, developing Asia is the only region which has shown increasing portion out of the global total. No other regions in the world have shown any increasing trend in terms of global share. So on the left-hand side scatter chart, what we are showing is that GVC's share out of the global total emissions tend to be associated positively with the GVC share of the global value added. So we can see the overall the positive association correlation between these two factors. And further, the GVC's share out of the global emissions tend to be higher, greater than the GVC share of the global value added, which means that most of the countries in this scattered chart are placed above the 45-degree line. This means how much the carbon-intensive GVC activities are compared to the overall the economic activities. This leads to again the positive association between GVC's share of the total value added and aggregate CO2 emission intensities. And then in the case of developing Asia, this positive correlation is more acute than any other regions in the world, showing the 0.7%, very high correlation between these two. So then now the big question is why we need to concerned about the GVC's impact of the emissions. The first one, again, is the GVC-related emissions are rising faster than any other sources in the world. And this is partly reflects the fact that most of the majority of the global production networks are weighted to relatively dirty industries, and then also entailing the dirty industry in terms of the making, offshoring, and outsourcing activities. And also the footloose nature of the GVC production makes the containing or controlling GVC emissions by one nation only. It needs concerted efforts by the international community, quite obviously. So to address the GVC-related emissions, we have come up with the 4 policy recommendations, which I already illustrated during my key message. So I'm going to be skipping here, but I will elaborate more on those components in the succeeding slides. So trade is believed to can contribute to greening and decarbonizing global value chain and globalization by promoting trade in the green goods and services, and then facilitating technological diffusion and also improving the production efficiency. But at the moment, global trade policies largely are geared toward favoring carbon-intensive trade. Actually, tariffs and non-tariff barriers are lower for the carbon-intensive goods. So going forward, we believe that the regional policymakers should aim to lower tariff and non-tariff barriers on climate-friendly products while reducing or eliminating subsidies on the carbon-intensive products, and also while at the same time encouraging the green products transfers. Okay. So on the left-hand side, what we are showing is that over time, many of the preferential trade agreements or free trade agreements have adopted environmental provisions, which is an encouraging sign for the prospect of the greening the global trade. So we have employed the so-called structural gravity model on the right-hand side. As we can see, the sheer number of PTA or the simple breadth of PTA tend to increase the CO2 emission embodied in trade due to the sheer scale effect by expanding the trade volume between trading partners. So, but when it comes to the environmental provisions contained inside FTAs or PTAs in particular, restricting environmental provisions tend to lower the CO2 emissions embodied in trade, in particular by reducing carbon intensity of the GVs trade between trading partners. The remaining 3 slides are dedicated to discussing the EU's CBAM, which is a quite hot topic at the moment around the globe and also for the region. We all know that the CBAM intends to contain the potential carbon leakages. Carbon leakage means some of the production capacity inside the EU could be relocated to other regions outside the EU. And so we have employed the so-called computational general equilibrium model, CG model, to estimate the different carbon price scenarios within the EU, and also the case where there is only ETS only, but also when the ETS is combined with the CBAM as the currently EU intends. So based on our simulation exercise, EU CBAM is estimated to reduce global emission by less than 0.2% only. Very marginal impact is expected. At the same time, the CBAM can have a substantial impact to some of the exports of some of the subregions in Asia, again, due to their quite significant export exposure to EU. But overall, the economic impact expected to be quite minimal. And last but not least, the EU CBAM is estimated to bring about the negative impact to the manufacturing output of some of downstream industries of the EU. We can think about a little bit about this. Before CBAM, the downstream industry within the EU could enjoy some cheap imports of the iron and steel and the fertilizer and other products to be covered by CBAM. But with the CBAM, the downstream industry will face quite high input prices, not only from the domestically sourced, but also import. Intermediate good price will rise to be on par with the EU's carbon price. So it will cause negative impact to downstream industry of the EU, and also some of the downstream industry may relocate some of the production capacity to other regions. So while there could be partial offsetting of the carbon leakage in the upstream ETS sector, there could be new level of the carbon leakage in the downstream industry inside the EU. So this means the CBAM could be interpreted as a tool, a bit poor tool, the shooting themselves on their foot. So we have also experimented some extended scenarios in the case where the other countries in OECD adopt the carbon pricing mechanism as well as the CBAM, and also even when the Asia's developed member countries adopt the CBAM and the carbon pricing mechanism. Apparently, the global CO2 emission reduction effect will be quite substantial, as you can see from the left-hand side chart. But again, the more significant negative impact to the exports from the region will be brought about due to this expanded adoption of the carbon pricing mechanism as well as CBAM. So the last slide, again, when we compare the different scenarios in terms of extended model of CBAM and the carbon pricing mechanism, there is no doubt that the emission reduction effect will be quite substantial. But when it comes to the economic impact of this extended model, the issue becomes a bit subtle. So when we consider the EU ETS and CBAM only in the first column of the right-hand side table, across the board, most of countries and regions will be affected negatively due to EU CBAM and the ETS. But when we consider the case where all other OECD members also adopt the carbon price mechanism as well as CBAM, as you can see, many of the developing economies in Asia will be benefiting from this extended model scenario. This is because now the source of the carbon leakage has been expanded from EU to encompass other OECD member countries. So developing Asian countries can benefit from the expanded source of the carbon leakage coming from not only from EU but also other OECD member countries. When we consider another extended model, when the ADB regional economies also adopt the carbon price mechanism as well as CBAM, still some of the developing economies can maintain potential positive economic impact, but big emitting economies like the PRC, India, and to a lesser extent Korea will suffer the most from this extended model because now they cannot enjoy anymore the carbon leakage from other regions. Then this kind of carbon leakage away from Asian developing economies will be benefiting other regions which have not adopted the carbon pricing mechanism as well, CBM, like the Eastern Europe, North America, and the Latin America, as you can see from the third column of this table. Okay, so let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jong-Woo Kang, for sharing the key findings of the Asia Economic Integration Report and sharing with us the state of the cross-border flows in the region, and also how GBCs is contributing to CO2 emission and ways to mitigate them. Now moving to the next session of the discussion, let me request our moderator and panelists to come on stage. Dr. Albert Park, Chief Economist and Director General of Asian Development Bank, will chair the session. Ms. Priyanka Kishore, Dr. Moitri Mukherjee, and Dr. Neil Foster McGregor. Let me now pass the floor to Dr. Albert Park to start the panel discussion.
Welcome, everyone. So we're going to try to dig a bit deeper into the implications of the report in today's panel discussion. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our panelists. The first panelist to my right is Priyanka Kishore, who is the founder and principal economist at Asia Decoded. Previous to that, spent some years working for Oxford Economics. Our second panelist is Dr. Moitra Mukherjee, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the Institute for Environment and Sustainability. And our third panelist is a senior economist from ADB, Neil Foster McGregor, who was the lead for the theme chapter on decarbonizing global value chains. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to do a first round of questions. We'll see how long that takes. Try to keep answers to 3 or 4 minutes if possible. And I have specific questions for each of the panelists to start. And then a bit later, there'll be an opportunity for members of the audience to get up at the mics and ask questions. So please think of questions that you may want to ask. Okay, so Priyanka, let me start with you and ask you a question about the report. It argues that global value chains have been important for development in developing countries. It's enabled them to shift into higher value-added activities, create jobs, boost productivity and growth. To what extent do you think the climate challenge is kind of putting this traditional approach to export-led growth at risk?
Thank you, Albert. Good morning, everybody. So when it comes to climate change, I think it's now quite obvious that Asia is sort of at more of a disadvantage than other regions in quite a few ways. First of all, we are warming faster, and those sitting in this room in Singapore can feel it. I'm quite sure about that. So last year, 2023, according to scientists, was the hottest recorded year so far. And we saw record-breaking temperatures in India, Bangladesh, Thailand, several parts of Asia. In the long run, when we are saying that by 2050, the world will be hotter by 1.5 degrees, some of our countries will be hotter by 2 to 4 degrees. So, clearly we are facing a bigger challenge there. That's not the only challenge. In addition to this, Asia is also more prone to extreme weather events, so lethal heat waves, floods, and droughts. In 2022, floods alone had an economic cost of $25 billion plus for this region. So clearly the physical climate risks that are facing this part of the world are large, they're significant risks. This poses a challenge, not just for our physical capital, water supply, which of course are essential inputs into manufacturing, but also for our labor, human capital. Now, empirically, we know that the relationship between temperature and labor productivity, it's nonlinear. It peaks at 13 degrees of annual temperature. To put things in perspective, Singapore's mean temperature last year was 28.2 degrees. And it's also now well established that at higher temperature, labor productivity declines significantly. So taken together, this poses quite substantial challenges to the manufacturing sector and the GVC-oriented trade model that has benefited the region so much. If you want to put some numbers out there, then there are several estimates. One I could quote is that unless we have adequate adaptation and mitigation strategies, we could end up with GDP losses between 3 to 4 trillion annually by 2050. So that's the scale of impact we're talking about. Also, what is worrying is that this impact is more for developing Asia rather than developed Asia. This is partly to do with the location and the geography of developing Asia, but it's also the stage of development which makes them more keen to keep the existing infrastructure and the low-cost fossil technology that's helping them along. So it's really important that we put this into context of future economic costs that climate change could impact and spur along on adaptation and mitigation. And here I think the theme of today's report and presentation is very much in sync. Any sort of mitigation strategy in Asia has to focus with the industrial sector. That accounts for more than 35% of emissions. And now we know that GVCs are the fastest growing contributor to that. We've already spoken about how that could happen, so I will skip that. Two final points I want to make it that such a strategy, it would sit well with businesses, so you would get their collaboration because many of them have net zero targets themselves. And from a macro point of view, it just does not help East Asia, which is already quite integrated into GVCs, and so it has an inherent interest in safeguarding its production networks. But if we make green infrastructure a bargaining chip for GVCs, the new entrants like India, they also have an incentive to spur this transition.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So that's a very interesting point that without adaptation, just higher heat will reduce labor productivity. It will actually make Asia less competitive in a very direct way in trade and manufacturing activity. Thank you. Let me go on to, do any other panelists want to respond to this point about whether climate change is putting the export-led growth model at risk? Yeah.
Maybe just building upon a little bit what Priyanka said at the start of her intervention, she talked about the fact that the impacts of climate change, also the impacts of climate change policies are uneven. And you focused a little bit on the cross-country dimension, that extreme weather events are more prolific in other parts of the world than others. So I think that's one aspect. But I think we're also going to see that these effects are uneven within countries as well, because we see as climate change takes place, there will be regions that are more affected by it than others. Climate change can lead to shifts in the comparative advantages of countries. So we also need to think a little bit about what the response is internally. And I think there's a societal dimension to that in the context of reducing the inequalities that may arise from climate change, and obviously things like social assistance will be relevant for that. But also in terms of the production, we also need to think about where the opportunities might lie in global value chains as comparative advantages change, and how can governments facilitate that? How can they train their workers and encourage firms to shift into the kind of activities that are going to be relevant in a world where the climate looks different to what it does today?
Right, because with the rise of global value chains, falling logistics, so there's still huge benefits to trade, and that won't change. But if we think about carbon pricing in a real sense, that should give you a direction for the activities that need to shift within trade to make trade more consistent with the climate agenda. And so I think, because the green transition will create some growth sectors, especially in renewable energy and other types of complementary goods. So those would be the areas where there's no reason Asia couldn't be part of that growth, export-led growth scenario in principle, although even in those goods, there's more protectionism and other things happening. So, okay, great. Let me move on to Moitra and ask you the next question. The report shows that developing Asia plays an outsized role in GVC-related emissions, reflecting its positioning in the global division of labor. What should the policy priorities for the region be in order to limit its contribution to emissions through global value chains?
Thank you, Albert, for your question. So I think the policy options, the solutions to decarbonize GVCs is well known. Pricing carbon, and that's the textbook solution, pricing carbon accordingly so that it can internalize or it can capture the externality costs, motivating both manufacturing sectors and GVC suppliers to transition into low carbon and cleaner production options. However, the real challenge lies in how to apply these policy options, how to price carbon so that the prices are uniformly applied. There's a global consensus, there's a global cooperation in which there's a uniform carbon pricing everywhere, and pricing carbon is not just an kind of like a tax mechanism, but it also comes with a lot of technological and digital preparation in form of having a robust accounting framework that is uniform across countries, regionally and internationally. Then how to develop within countries, within developing countries, a monitoring, reporting, and verification system. This is just the measurement of various manufacturing units. It is not only not only is it expensive, but it is also, it needs a lot of technical and digital expertise. So how does these accounting framework, having a uniform pricing, global cooperation, all these can be developed while helping developing countries kind of like build up their green transition trajectories, help them to build their capacities technologically and financially so as to move towards cleaner production methods, low carbon transitions, and having a better carbon pricing system. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on this one?
Just to add, I think that's a very valid point, but we were talking about trade policies earlier, and I think that becomes important in the context of not just including environmental clauses, but also in terms of financing, because it's easier said than done. The developing countries which most need to green their supply chains lack the resources in terms of how they can actually do that. So one thing is, actually collection of funds, and the other thing is also the technology transfer that trade pacts can actually facilitate and enable them to design these policies in a way where they can, actually start considering more efficient outcomes, electrification of production, and eventually aiding a move towards, other energy resources. So it's not something I feel that developing economies can achieve only on their own. They need international cooperation.
They need money.
They need money.
Right? Yeah, so we always get back. Yeah,
Maybe
did you want to
follow up to
yes,
Priyanka's
sure.
comment, I would just like to add, so yes, they need money, and that can also help along with trade policies, having domestic policies where you can have tax incentives for FDIs, for more foreign investments to come into the national economy, and that helps kind of development in green technologies rather than energy-intensive technologies. That would also help to bring in more finance and help developing economies transition towards a clean production pathway.
Right. I mean, one thing, it's interesting to note, most countries in the region, well, all countries have, declared nationally determined contribution goals, commitments, and so carbon pricing still is the most efficient way to get to whatever goal you set in some sense. It'll reduce the economic cost of getting to where you want to go. That said, for many governments, I think there's this real fear if I'm going to tax my firms, and especially if other competitors are not, then I'm kind of really hurting the economy. And so I think there's this idea that we need finance to really support that, which I think is also very important. Of course, you could get some finance from carbon taxation or ETS systems themselves. They can raise some revenue that you could recycle into supporting adjustment. But I think increasingly we feel, from a historical standpoint. There needs to be more north-south kind of resource flow somehow through different market or other government cooperation mechanisms. Okay, so let me turn to Neil. The report provides evidence suggesting that the presence of environmental provisions in trade agreements can reduce emissions embodied in GVCs. Do you think trade agreements provide a realistic pathway for reducing emissions in global value chains? And I was curious, what are the specific types of things that provisions you could put into trade agreements that would be most beneficial in this respect?
Yeah, I mean, I guess taking a step back a little bit, we need to think to what extent trade agreements can actually be a force for liberalization before we can think about their role in reducing the impacts of climate change. And I think if the report shows, if you look over the last 25 years, that the rise in the number of trade agreements has been significant. A huge number of new trade agreements have been signed in the last 25, 30 years. Not only that, they're covering more and more aspects, so that they're beyond tariffs and non-tariff barriers. They discuss investment. They have provisions regarding environmental provisions, obviously, but also labor rights, intellectual property, and so on and so on. So they've expanded both in number and in terms of scope. And I guess it's not unfair to say that, again, over the last 25 years or so, trade agreements have been the major force for liberalization. So in the context of the difficulties of generating a multilateral agreement through the WTO, trade agreements have been the sort of default option for countries to liberalize their trade. So in that sense, they provide an opportunity. And if we now look at the sort of extent of trade that occurs through trade agreements, we're looking at sort of 50 to 60% of total trade flows are somehow within a trade agreement. So the potential for them to reduce emissions through trade is obviously quite stark. And what we look at in the report, of course, is just to sort of examine if a trade agreement has an environmental provision, does that have an impact upon the emissions that are embodied in trade? And we find that does to an extent. But then sort of shifting to your question about what are the kinds of things that these agreements can include, I think that there are various things that we could perhaps consider. No? So one obviously is to harmonize environmental standards, to set that level playing field so that all firms within a trade agreement across these different countries have a common set of regulations and standards to which they work to. I think these trade agreements can include aspects related to sort of the monitoring of emissions, so to speak. So have frameworks that allow for the measurement, which I think was also addressed by Moicha in an earlier question, so that again there's a good understanding and an acknowledgement of the direction that we're moving into. So it can be an important monitoring mechanism. Obviously, the major thing that we need to do, and again I think it's also hinted at in one or two of the responses so far, is that we need to encourage the flow of technology across borders, particularly green technologies. We need to encourage the flow of green goods and services across borders, and that's, I guess, where trade agreements have their largest role, through sort of lowering tariffs, through facilitating trade. These would be the major areas through which trade agreements can work. It could also be that if we think ahead, that trade agreements might involve in the future provisions related to carbon pricing to a greater extent than they do already, for example. So we could have some of these carbon pricing mechanisms embedded in trade agreements. And I guess the final comment is sort of a footnote to all of that, because that all sounds very positive, and that these trade agreements can be a significant force for decarbonizing trade. But there is also a risk, of course, which is that while trade agreements can reduce the carbon emissions embodied in the trade that's exchanged between trade partners, what could be happening is that all the dirty trade is just being shifted to those countries where you don't have a trade agreement with. No? So there's this possibility of diversion of dirty goods to other countries. So I guess the conclusion is that trade agreements can be a force for decarbonizing, but they have to be in consort with also multilateral efforts to sort of generate a rules-based system. And that trade agreements alone, because of this risk, again, of sort of the diversion of dirty trade to trade outside of these agreements is always present.
Great. Does anyone else want to comment on this?
Maybe I can just add a short follow-up comment on while preferential trade agreements with proper environmental provisions are very helpful, but most countries, and specifically in developing economies, the governments, the challenge that they face is that the trade-off between the fossil fuel intensive economies that they're already locked in. and how do they suddenly transition into a cleaner, greener production, and which is something very new to them. That means not only building up more capacity, technical knowledge, but also almost revamping their supply chain, whole supply chain production system. So at one point, there could be more political will and kind of like long-term views, because these things, climate change is real, and the impacts will happen, and in the long term, if not immediately, but in 10, 20, 30 years, the how economies are running, and these will change, these pathways will change. So from the government, if they can have this long-term vision, then through how do they transition their economies from energy intense to more low carbon economy, that is the key, and this won't happen overnight. So at one time, both fossil fuel intensive as well as green technologies, they will develop parallelly. However, how you kind of like phasing out subsidies from energy intense sectors and having more tax intensive tax credits, having more subsidies towards the green technologies, that will help countries and governments to slowly transition towards a cleaner, low-carbon, green economy.
And one thing I think that's encouraging, also coming from data in the report, is that we actually do see globally and in Asia a really sharp increase in FDI in renewable energy sectors and a very clear decline in investment in the fossil fuel sectors. So at least that's pointing in the right direction. But we've been emphasizing in ADB for a while, you know, as you, I think, referred to, a very high priority has to be on at least getting rid of fuel subsidies, which are a negative carbon tax, right? And still very pervasive around the region. And just saving that subsidy money and using it for renewables, it could actually finance quite a lot of renewable activity. So that's kind of a no-brainer almost, but still, you know, not always politically easy. Okay. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say, just by way of optimism, is, you know, it's impressive that there are still so many agreements being signed, right? And also in Asia Pacific, we also have the RCEP agreement that went into force relatively recently, and I think countries are still learning how to use that agreement to further integrate value chains, and hopefully that will provide a platform to increase the regional and global integration going forward. Okay. I'm trying to be cognizant of time. I think we still have a little bit more time. Let me go back to maybe a second round of questions and come back to Priyanka. How will the persistent geopolitical tensions affect the reconfiguration of global value chains, in your view? And how will it affect kind of economic efficiency as well as environmental footprints of global production networks?
Everything.
That's a big question.
It's all in one.
Yeah, that's a big question.
I think just to begin, whenever we have these discussions, it's very useful that we remind ourselves it's actually businesses who do the supply chains, not the governments. So the governments can encourage, discourage, facilitate, be an obstacle, but eventually it's the company which has to decide where it's going to either build its supply chain or where it's going to shift production. And typically, you know, these are based on economic and other consideration. They will have an eye on profitability, maximizing shareholder value. And at least in the democratic world, they will not pay that much, you know, real heed to political allegiances. They might pay lip service, but when it comes to decision making, it's these factors that go into play. So in this context, if we look at Asia, creeping diversification has been happening. It's been happening since 2010s, when you saw low value added manufacturing move out from China, going to Vietnam, Bangladesh. And that was driven by comparative advantage considerations. Labor costs picked up in China. These were cheaper locations, and we saw a shift there. And these kind of diversification will continue to play out even as we go ahead. But what we are talking about really geopolitics giving it a spur. And the governments realize this, that they need to make a business case for businesses to move, and hence we have tariffs, we have sanctions, and now we have very large industrial policies, which we are very not sure where will be funded from, because, you know, there are so many funding priorities already in place. So yes, they're trying to influence the businesses in a more commercial manner to actually reshore or nearshore, and maybe that does give it some speed going forward. But if we just look at the data right now, there's not really a very strong evidence that on a whole scale manufacturing is moving out of China to other parts of the world. You're hearing about some reshoring of production, but again, it's to be very careful how you're interpreting the data. So if I look at the example of, how everybody's talking about China's share in US imports has tanked, and that slack has been picked up by Mexico, Vietnam, and India, and that's what the gross exports data show us. But if we look at alternate indicators, such as like container shipments, they're showing a huge jump in shipments from China to Mexico. And then when you look at data between China and Vietnam, you're seeing that the same components that Vietnam is exporting more to the US, China is exporting more to Vietnam. So yes, there is reconfiguration. It's just not probably the way we thought it would happen. What we are probably seeing is longer and more complicated supply chains instead of just things coming one stop, they're coming two stop. De-risking or decoupling is clearly easier said than done. And that's important for the second part of the question which you put out to me in terms of how this impacts economic efficiency or environmental concerns. Because if you're actually moving out because of comparative advantage reasons, it affects your efficiency positively. Obviously, that's economics 101. But if you're moving because of all these other factors where governments are subsidizing you and things like that, and that's actually taking place, then eventually over the medium to long term, what you will see is that these subsidies are really not enough to compensate for other costs of production, like higher labor costs and other issues around setting up infrastructure for those industries to function, because the countries are not completely set up for this. They deindustrialized decades ago, so building it back is not so easy. And so that really sets up for structurally higher inflation in the medium to long run, with the only caveat I would add is that unless labor productivity picks up because of AI and stuff. But I think that's a gamble, a big gamble to take when you're doing these things without taking into consideration the negative economic fallouts that will come to bite. The same, I think, applies even to the environmental footprint, which is the third part of the question. A case has been made that if you nearshore or friendshore or reshore, the supply chain is shorter. But as I just said, I think they're longer and they're more complicated. And that's not reducing your carbon footprint, that's actually adding to your carbon footprint. It also matters which stage of production you're actually reshoring. So if I just talk about semiconductors, you're bringing fab plants back to US, you're talking about fab plants in Japan. These are pretty environmental unfriendly, manufacturing. They have huge gallons of water a day is needed, very high on energy needs, and generate a lot of hazardous waste. So I think these are very complicated questions. There is no straightforward answer as to at this point of time as to how your environment footprint actually changes. Important is to not just focus on the positive, but also take into account the negatives and make a balanced decision.
Thank you. I think your answer reflects a real trust in the discipline of the market of driving efficiency and that.
The consumer, I believe the consumer will set things right eventually.
But I mean, your point is being tested today, though, because we see a proliferation of industrial policy almost everywhere, especially in richer countries. And so the question is, have the design of those industrial policy learned lessons from previous experience, or are they going to learn things the hard way again? Or will it be successful to some extent in certain sectors or industries? But yeah, it doesn't seem to be following a very compelling economic logic, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
More, it's following a political logic that may get undermined by the economics.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I also personally do not see that these countries have, at least in the case of nearer home to Japan, which also wants to step up spending on defense and really needs to step up spending on social welfare and things like that, that it can actually spare the kind of financing. In India itself, the very hyped product-linked incentive scheme has disappeared sort of from the headlines because the government is not able to find the money, or it's not generating the outcomes. So you're seeing examples that these were more headlines rather than actual outcomes, and we will see. I think the US is the only one which has shown some sort of reshoring at this point of time, but as you said, it's very much open to how it plays out at this point of time.
Did anyone else want to jump in here?
Maybe just a short comment, because I think Priyanka's initial response was actually very, very interesting now, because essentially what she was arguing, I think, was that there's been some reconfiguration of global value chains, but otherwise it's much ado about nothing in terms of this reshoring and nearshoring. And I guess we can sort of extend that a little bit to think about that, again, the last 20 odd years. And GVCs have proven to be quite resilient. No? I mean, after the global financial crisis, they responded quite well. After the pandemic, they've responded quite well. They've not really been overly affected by all of the trade wars and so on that have been taking place. But then I guess I leave you with a question, which is the past a good predictor of the future? Because if we think about some of the aspects regarding the geopolitical aspects today, it's around microchips and so on. But maybe the new battleground will be about climate technologies, about the critical minerals and so on that will feed these green technologies and so on. So it could be that as we move forward, global value chains may sort of have additional risks, which maybe are even stronger because as I say, the source of tension is actually these climate change technologies and the critical resources that are fundamental to these technologies. So I'll leave you with a question more than a comment.
Right. Well, the tragedy will be if the geopolitics leads to battle over green technology and goods in a way that just raises the cost of these goods and really slows the green transition ultimately. Okay, cognizant of time, I think we have a few more minutes. I think we started a little bit late to the panel part. So let me move on to, this is an interesting question about the role of multinationals for Moitra. So multinationals are a key driver of GVCs, with inward FDI into Asia often considered to have a dual role, shifting emissions-intensive production into the region, kind of maybe a pollution haven type argument, but also providing technology knowledge that can improve emissions efficiency. So do you have any suggestions on policies that governments can use to try to ensure that FDI can be part of the solution rather than the problem when it comes to climate change?
I think we have already touched on that point earlier, so I'll try to be very short here. Mainly, while FDIs are always welcome, but then again the trade-off is economic development at the cost of the environment, or economic development including environment as well. So stronger environmental standards, regulatory policies, and tax policies can help to ensure that these FDIs are channeled towards what is needed rather than being channeled into more dirty industries. So that's one aspect of it, and again bringing kind of like following up my earlier point on carbon pricing. So while carbon pricing, it's a big challenge to implement it, but it also kind of assures a big opportunity in terms of revenues, which governments need to finance development of data collection system, monitoring, reporting, verification system, technological development, capacity building, and everything. So it cannot be even carbon pricing with baby steps and slowly with 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plans. It can develop into a powerful tool for government to collect, to generate enough revenues that can be channeled towards developing these clean production supply chains. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to the last question so we can get to the audience Q&A. This is for Neil. The report touches on the role of innovation and technology, and specifically the diffusion of technology as a means of mitigating climate change. What role do GVCs have in maximizing these potential benefits of innovation and technology for emissions reduction?
Yeah, so the report, as John Gore has already presented, it sort of showcases that actually if we think about NETS and CBAM, the impacts on emissions globally are not particularly large, but there may be some negative impacts on GDP and exports. But there's some additional results in the report that sort of show if we can also achieve some kind of convergence in emissions intensities, so say the Asian economies could converge to the emissions intensities of the OECD, then we can see much larger impacts upon emissions, and actually the impacts upon GDP and exports can be reduced. So you can sort of mitigate that trade-off to some extent. So technology is obviously a crucial driver of emissions intensity, efficiency improvements. And so the question is, to what extent can these technologies encourage that? And if we have a carbon price that's accompanied by technology diffusion and so on, can that be the driver of decarbonisation? And I think what the report also sort of touches upon is this idea that carbon pricing alone may not be able to achieve that. Unless it's accompanied by or leads to this technology diffusion, then we're not going to see the huge reductions in emissions, and we're not going to see that shift to a new production system that we need. So then how can technology do that? And one of the challenges we face in that, of course, is that technology in general is highly concentrated. Technology in green technologies is also highly concentrated. So some reports suggest that 90% of green patents, so environmentally sound technologies, the patents have come from 5 countries. That's China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea in this region, plus Germany, plus the US. So what does that mean for the rest of the world if they're not actually producing these technologies? It means that technology somehow has to diffuse from these 5 economies, no? And so the question is, can global value chains then play a role in doing that? And I think they potentially can. No? Global value chains have been shown to be a source of technology diffusion in a general sense, so they could be sort of applied to the diffusion of green technologies. In order to do that, we need to sort of generate global value chains governance frameworks that are not so hierarchical, that are more evenly evenly distributed in terms of the power relations within global value chains. We need to think about what are the capabilities that non-lead firms in global value chains need in order to adopt these technologies. And we need to incentivize somehow, and I think this links back to the last question, we need to incentivize somehow lead firms, the big multinationals in global value chains, to actually provide that technology in some form. Now, that they may have self-motivation to do this, but it may also be that they need to be incentivized to do this in some way. Now, I guess those are sort of the three ways in which global value chains can serve that purpose.
Thank you. Yeah, please jump in.
Just a very quick follow-up again. So while technology diffusion is very important to ensure this green transition, but I would like to highlight what our institute does a lot between this forward and backward relationship between technology and policy. While technologies are often, technology drives policies so that the diffusion happens, but policies can also drive technologies for further innovation as well as diffusion. So there is a kind of like quite dynamic and interactive role between technologies and policies. So how government kind of crafts or designs these policies to enable more technology diffusion as well as innovation and scale up, that is something that we really need to understand and study further.
Right. So there's this whole part about absorbing the technologies. I don't know if it's produced by just these 5 countries, but trade barriers aside, I think firms need to first understand the technologies. Yeah. They may need certain skills or managerial capacities to adopt technologies or maintain them. So all of this probably maybe could benefit from some more positive policy action. I think is maybe something you're suggesting. Okay, great. This has been very fascinating, but I think we have maybe 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So please, please introduce yourself, your name and where your organization or where you're from, and then please go ahead and ask a question.
Sure. My name is Carol Yuan. I'm a researcher at the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law, EPSEL. So we've heard a lot about decarbonizing through trade, and also we've heard about how expanding the CBAM to the Asian region can decrease carbon emissions by quite a lot, and also about environmental provisions in trade agreements. I would like to hear from the panelists, what do you think are the priority sub-regions or countries where we will see this decarbonizing take place sooner, considering, of course, whether they have the financing means and their openness towards decarbonizing. So it will be great to hear where we might see this happen, and perhaps there could also be more efforts to target those areas. Thank you.
Panelists, do you want to take that on?
Okay, maybe have a first stab. Yeah.
Thanks, Neil.
Where? Who are the leaders?
Leaders.
Yeah. Well, I would maybe turn the question around a little bit to make it a little bit easier to answer. But if we think about CBAM, if we think about the major challenges, it's about sectors, no? It's about certain activities and certain sectors. So then we should look at maybe the countries in the region that are heavily invested in those sectors, and I'm thinking things like steel production and so on, and what are the technologies that are available. So again, we were talking a few days ago about the context of steel and the way that steel production in the EU, for example, has shifted. It's shifted away from sort of very much coal-based towards electric arc furnaces and so on. We've seen that technological shift towards new technologies. And so I guess in the context of the region, then the big producers, so India, for example, and one or two others, would have the opportunities maybe to try and shift into those technologies. And that's where you may see the bigger movements. And it's about sort of, again, it's about adopting the right technologies and observing what's happening elsewhere and emissions reductions that are occurring through this technological advancement that may be the initial driver of change in the region. It's not a full answer, but maybe it starts a discussion at least.
Just to add a bit of context, it's also difficult to assess when you say who is moving the fastest. If I look back at the latest COP, the NDCs of countries vary a lot. So for example, India and China are doing very well on the NDCs, but their NDCs are considered to be much weaker than some of the advanced nations in the region who are actually lagging on their NDCs. So it's also up to the countries, how they are portraying themselves. And as Maitri mentioned earlier, measurement is a challenge, is a huge challenge as to actually come up with the design and authenticity of what is being reported and how you are tracking it. So there are several dimensions. So it's difficult to just look at one parameter and say that this is a leader. What is interesting is that the advanced nations who have the resources, you might expect them to be the leaders, but I wouldn't say necessarily so.
If you took progress in carbon pricing as an indicator of
Singapore
leading in decarbonization, then I think it would have to be China, which now has a national emissions trading scheme. It would have to be Singapore, which has a carbon tax that they're at least planning to ramp up to higher rates, and Korea, which also has a national emissions trading scheme. But what's encouraging is that other countries in the region, especially the large economies, are all planning to make progress on carbon markets. So India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Kazakhstan have all signaled that they're going to be working on similar types of schemes. And Japan, too, is likely to expand its emission trading scheme. Okay, any other questions? Don't be shy. We have mics on either aisle. Okay, I knew the silence would eventually get someone. As a longtime professor, you learn to be comfortable with these awkward pauses, because then it puts pressure on everyone to stand up and say something. Yeah. Go ahead. Thank you.
I'm a reporter with Reuters.
Oh, right.
And I would like to ask generally about CBAM. I mean, from this report, there's been a lot of, it's kind of a negative impacts that we've heard about. It's not going to have a great impact on cutting emissions. It's going to lead possibly to negative impacts in Europe from downstream industries. But generally, do you see that CBAM or something like it does have a role in the transition and in decarbonizing value chains? In principle, is it a good idea? Thank you.
Panelists.
Maybe I'll just kind of make a try first. So for CBAM, it is how kind of according to my personal interpretation. So CBAM is still at a transitional phase, and it is kind of more in a preparation, and it targets the heavy manufacturing industries and very specific ones like steel, cement, and more energy intensive one, and electricity. And it would be actually the teeth and claws will be implemented only 2 years later, from 2026. So this puts on, in some form, an international or global pressure on countries to act. So CBAM, we cannot see it as one single tool. So it's always different, a portfolio of policies. Countries have already declared their NDCs after the Paris Agreement, and carbon pricing is being seen as a major tool, and different countries are at different levels in terms of developing carbon pricing as a tool nationally. And So CBAM kind of puts a more pressure on, at the national level, to countries, these producer countries, to strengthen their carbon pricing tool. If you can see it that way, I think maybe because if a supplier country has a strong carbon pricing system in place, then probably CBAM won't be implemented because the same emissions cannot be charged twice. So this is more as an international pressure to accelerate these other tools that can help in decarbonization. So that could be one way of seeing it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, no, maybe just, I mean, I agree fully with that. I think that's a very good response. I guess one other thing is that you can sort of congratulate the EU on is that they see a problem, they see the urgency, and they move. They do something. And what we're not seeing elsewhere maybe is that people are not doing something. So I think we should think about that as it's a step. And I guess the risk with when you make a relatively quick step and you do something different is that you don't always take along all the stakeholders with you. So I think in this transition phase, what you maybe have is an opportunity for increased dialogue to try and maximize the benefits beyond the examples that you were talking about in terms of encouraging carbon pricing more generally. But again, I mean, how can the EU assist countries in the region, for example, in maximizing any potential benefits from CBAM? So again, I'm always thinking about technology, but I think that's a crucial point. And potentially there's a win-win. I mean, if the EU's stated aim is also to sort of encourage other countries to take this more seriously and to sort of invest in the kind of technologies, invest in carbon pricing mechanisms, then if there are opportunities for the EU to talk with other countries in the region and develop mechanisms, so maybe even using some of the CBAM revenue for climate finance and so on, then there's a potential win-win. The EU gets what it wants, it pushes these countries to act, and countries in the region get the kind of technologies and so on that they need to also make that transition from a carbon base to a green economy.
And following on from the technology point, the CBAM, because now it is in the transitional phase, the focus is on measurements and reporting. So this also, because there is no financial clause yet, and this helps the supplier countries, those who are developing, to kind of step up and develop their at least these emissions measurements and reporting systems, which are not in place yet.
Great. And with that, I think we are at time. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their excellent comments in this discussion. It's been really fascinating.
Dr. Shore, Dr. Moitri, and Neil for the very interesting panel discussion. And thank you, all of you, for your patience listening to our presentation and giving us few questions also. So let me close this session and this event for today. I hope to see you around here or in Manila. We can continue this discussion here or in the foyer. We have some coffee and some snacks there. Thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you.